Sweat doesn't lie. It smells like iron and fear when a man finally realizes he's drowning in his own depth. Donovan weighed 265 pounds of pure hostility. Reese Lee barely cracked 140. What happened next took exactly 5 seconds, leaving a mountain of muscle gasping on rubber mats like a beached shark. Chalk dust coated the back of Cole's throat, a permanent fixture in the oxygen-starved air of Ironworks Gym. He dragged a sour-smelling towel across the vinyl of a flat bench, feeling the ripped seam where the foam padding bled out. It was a Tuesday afternoon in July. The swamp cooler in the corner rattled with a rhythmic metallic cough, spitting warm, damp air onto men who were already drowning in their own perspiration. Cole chewed the inside of his cheek, tasting a faint copper tang, and watched the meatheads do what meatheads always did. Donovan was the undisputed king of the free weight corner. He was a walking monument to excess, 265 pounds of thick, veiny mass crammed into a gray cut-off shirt that had long since surrendered its original shape. His neck was a stump of roped muscle merging directly into his jawline. Donovan didn't just lift weights, he assaulted them. He demanded an audience. Every repetition of his dumbbell presses was punctuated by a wet, guttural roar that echoed off the corrugated tin roof. When he finished a set, he didn't set the 120-pound bells down. He dropped them. Crash. The plywood subfloor groaned in protest. Dust drifted down from the rafters. Donovan stood up, chest heaving, spreading his lats so wide his arms couldn't rest against his sides. He looked around, his small, bloodshot eyes daring anyone to complain about the noise. Nobody did. Cole just sighed, tossing the dirty rag into a plastic bucket. Men like Donovan were brittle inside. Cole had worked the front desk long enough to know that the louder the grunt, the deeper the insecurity. Donovan needed the iron to validate his existence. He needed the space he occupied to be aggressively acknowledged. Then the front door hinge shrieked, a high-pitched scrape of metal on metal. Reese walked in. He didn't look like he belonged in Ironworks. He wore a faded navy blue tracksuit, the zipper pulled halfway down, revealing a plain white cotton tee. He carried a canvas duffel bag that looked older than he was. He was small. 140 pounds, maybe, if his pockets were full of change. Against the backdrop of massive, chemically enhanced bodies grunting in the dim light, Reese looked like a pencil sketch slipped into an oil painting. But Cole couldn't stop looking at him. It wasn't awe, it was confusion. Everyone else in the gym moved with a heavy, lumbering gravity, fighting the weight of their own bodies. Reese didn't. He walked lightly, his cheap canvas shoes making absolutely no sound on the rubber mats. He didn't bounce on his toes or puff his chest out. He possessed an agonizingly calm economy of motion. He didn't waste a single calorie. When he turned his head to scan the room, his shoulders stayed perfectly still. He was relaxed, yet completely coiled, like a piece of high-tensile wire resting on a table. Reese found an empty patch of floor near the heavy bag, just 10 feet from where Donovan was holding court. He unzipped his duffel, pulled out a roll of thin white athletic tape, and sat on a wooden plyometric box. He began wrapping his left hand. Donovan noticed him immediately. Cole watched the big man's posture shift. The baseline aggression in Donovan's shoulders sharpened into something uglier. He hated anything he didn't understand, and he fundamentally did not understand Reese. To Donovan, value was measured in displacement, how much air you took up, how much iron you could rip off the floor. This wiry, quiet Chinese man sitting in his peripheral vision was an insult to the hierarchy of the room. Donovan grabbed a handful of chalk from the communal bucket, grinding it aggressively between his thick palms. The white dust plumed into the air. He stepped purposefully out of his zone, closing the distance to Reese. He stopped just close enough to cast a shadow over the wooden box. Reese didn't look up. He held the tape between his teeth, tore it with a sharp, dry reap, and smoothed it over his knuckles. "You lost, buddy?" Donovan's voice was a low rumble, thick with phlegm and artificial testosterone. Reese flattened the tape against his wrist, checking the tension. He slowly raised his head. His expression was completely blank. No polite smile, no intimidated flinch. Just a flat, dark gaze that seemed to look right through the fleshy mass of Donovan's chest. "I am here to train," Reese said. His voice was soft, melodic, but carried a strange, resonant clarity over the dull hum of the gym. Donovan scoffed, a wet sound in the back of his throat. He hooked his thumbs into the belt of his lifting shorts. "Train what? Calisthenics? This is a heavy gym, pal. We actually push weight here. The aerobics studio's down the street." "No?" Cole leaned against the front desk, his stomach tightening. He'd seen Donovan bully high school kids out of the gym. He'd seen him intimidate grown men who accidentally took a plate from his bench. It was a sick game. Donovan needed the submission to feed his ego. Reese finished wrapping his left hand and picked up his right. He began feeding the tape between his fingers. "I do not need your weights," Reese said, his tone perfectly even. "I only need the floor." Donovan shifted his weight. His massive thigh brushed against the heavy bag hanging next to Reese, sending it swinging slightly on its thick chain. "You're taking up oxygen, short round, and I don't like the way you look at me. Matter of fact, I don't like your kind coming in here pretending you know something about being a man. Take your fortune cookies, pack up your little duffel bag, and go back to Chinatown." The words hung in the muggy air, heavy and foul. The rhythmic clanking of plates across the room suddenly stopped. A guy on the lat pull-down machine froze mid-rep. The low murmur of conversation evaporated. The only sound left was the rattling cough of the swamp cooler and the squeak of Reese's tape stretching over his skin. Cole stopped breathing. He waited for the anger. He waited for Reese's face to flush red, for the veins to pop in his neck, for his voice to shake with indignation. That was the human reaction. That was how you responded to a slur spit directly into your face by a giant. But Reese did absolutely nothing. His heart rate didn't elevate. Cole watched the side of Reese's neck. There was no rapid pulsing of the carotid artery. Reese's pupils didn't dilate in panic. Instead, Reese just sat there, meticulously smoothing the final piece of tape over his thumb. He looked at Donovan not with rage, but with the cold, detached curiosity of a mechanic inspecting a deeply flawed engine. "You are very large," Reese said quietly, "but you are entirely empty." Donovan's face flushed a deep, blotchy crimson. The insult didn't register as a martial arts taunt. It hit him right in his deepest, most closely guarded insecurity. He wasn't just big. He was desperate. And this little man saw right through the meat to the hollow core. "What did you say to me, you little freak?" Donovan snarled, his hands balling into fists the size of cured hams. Reese stood up. He didn't jump to his feet. He just flowed upward, gravity seemingly forgetting to pull at his limbs. He stood loose, his arms hanging relaxed at his sides. The top of his head barely reached Donovan's collarbone. The physical disparity between them was comical. A mastiff cornering a stray cat. "I said," Reese replied, his voice dropping half an octave, "you are empty. You have spent your whole life building a cage of muscle, but you forgot to put an animal inside. There." Donovan let out a roar, flecks of spit flying from his lips. He lunged. Cole's grip tightened on the edge of the front desk so hard his knuckles popped. He had seen bar fights. He had seen bouncers throw wild, drunken haymakers. But watching Donovan move was terrifying, purely because of the mass involved. 265 pounds of bone and dense tissue hurling forward. Time didn't slow down for Cole, but the mechanics of the violence suddenly became brutally clear. Second one. Donovan telegraphed his strike from a mile away. To generate power, the big man dipped his right shoulder, pulling his massive arm back to load a looping overhand right. It was a punch meant to crush a skull against the floorboards, but in doing so, he shifted his center of gravity too far forward. His heavy work boots suddenly anchored, unable to pivot. He was committed. A runaway freight train with no brakes. Reese did not step back. That was the first thing that broke Cole's brain. Human instinct dictates retreat in the face of an overwhelming object. You step away from a falling tree. Reese stepped in. Second two, as Donovan's fist arced through the damp air, tearing the oxygen apart with a dull whoosh, Reese shifted his lead foot 2 inches to the right. He didn't block the punch. He simply vacated the space where Donovan expected his head to be. The massive fist grazed the shoulder of Reese's tracksuit, a glancing whisper of fabric. Donovan's momentum carried him off balance. His ribs, thick with muscle but exposed, opened up entirely. Reese's posture changed. The relaxed, slouching man vanished. In his place was a kinetic chain of pure, unadulterated biomechanical efficiency. The movement started in his back foot, driving into the rubber mat, traveling up his calf, torquing through his hips, and snapping up his spine. Second 3. Reese threw a straight lead punch. It wasn't a boxing jab. It wasn't a wild hook. It was a vertical fist, launched from his hip with no windup, no warning. It bypassed Donovan's thick chest muscles and aimed precisely for the small, unprotected triangle of cartilage just below the sternum, the solar plexus. Cole didn't just see the strike, he felt it in his own teeth. The sound wasn't the cinematic smack of leather on skin, it was a wet, hollow thud. It sounded like a butcher dropping a wooden mallet onto a slab of raw ribs. The kinetic energy of Reese's entire body weight, concentrated into 2 taped knuckles, transferred perfectly into Donovan's diaphragm. Second 4. Physics is unforgiving. When a nerve cluster like the celiac plexus suffers massive blunt force trauma, the diaphragm violently spasms. The lungs are instantly paralyzed. Donovan's eyes bulged from their sockets, the whites suddenly webbed with red veins. His jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. The aggressive roar died in his throat, replaced by a horrifying, high-pitched squeak of air escaping a crushing vacuum. All 265 pounds of him locked up. His massive arms, previously loaded with lethal intent, dropped limply to his sides like wet towels. Reese didn't pull his hand back immediately. He left it there for a fraction of a second, feeling the kinetic shockwave ripple through the big man's torso, making sure the circuit of violence was complete. Then, he smoothly retracted his arm, stepping laterally, slipping completely out of the giant's collapsing orbit. Second 5. Donovan's knees gave out. They didn't bend, they simply ceased to function. He dropped straight down, his thick shins slamming into the plywood with a sickening crack. He pitched forward, his face bouncing off the rubber mat. He rolled onto his side, his hands clawing desperately at his own chest, trying to rip open his ribs to let air in. He was suffocating in a room full of oxygen. His face cycled through colors rapidly. Pale white, then a deep plum purple. His lips pulled back over his teeth in a rictus of sheer animal panic. He sounded like a punctured tire, a raspy, pathetic wheeze pushing past his tongue. The silence in the gym returned, heavier and colder than before. Cole stood frozen. The rag he had been holding slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a soft slap. No one moved. The guy on the lat pull-down machine was still holding the bar in midair, his mouth hanging open. Reese stood over the gasping mountain of meat. He wasn't breathing hard. He wasn't sweating. The white tape on his knuckles wasn't even scuffed. He looked down at Donovan, watching the giant writhe on the floor, battling his own paralyzed respiratory system. Reese didn't gloat. He didn't drop a one-liner. He simply crouched down, balancing perfectly on the balls of his feet, bringing his face level with Donovan's purple, terrified eyes. "Muscles cannot breathe for you," Reese said softly. "They only demand more air. Air you do not have." Reese stood back up. He turned his back on the choking man, walked over to his duffel bag and pulled out a jump rope. He didn't look at the crowd of stunned lifters. He didn't look at Cole behind the desk. He walked to the center of the room, far away from the heavy bags, and began to skip. Whir, snap, whir, snap. The rhythmic sound of the rope cutting through the air filled the gym, keeping perfect time with Donovan's ragged, agonizing gasps for life. Whir, snap, whir, snap. Leather slapped against the sweat-stained rubber mat with a terrifying, metronomic consistency. Cole could not tear his eyes away from the jumping figure. Reese was no longer a static observer. He was a machine burning through fuel. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, catching the sickly yellow light of the overhead fluorescent bulbs. The rhythmic spinning of the jump rope created a tiny, localized vortex in the stagnant, iron-tasting air of the gym. 10 feet away, the king of the free weight corner was still drowning. Donovan had rolled onto his hands and knees, his massive head hanging low. Thick ropes of saliva dangled from his bottom lip, pooling onto the black floorboards. His skin had faded from purple to a sickening mottled gray, the color of wet concrete. He took a breath, and the sound that escaped his crushed diaphragm was a wet, ragged rattle. It sounded like a faulty exhaust pipe on a dying engine. His thick, veiny arms, which just moments ago had threatened to cave in a man's skull, now trembled violently under the sheer effort of keeping his torso elevated. No one rushed to help him. The paralysis infecting the gym was absolute. The guy on the lat pull-down machine, who had been frozen mid-repetition, slowly let the heavy rectangular plate slide back down the metal track. They clanked together with a timid, hollow thud. The sound was an intrusion, a violation of the fragile silence holding the room hostage. He quickly wiped his hands on his shorts and backed away from the machine, suddenly terrified of making any noise at all. Cole watched a drop of Donovan's sweat hit the chalk-dusted floor. The big man was broken. The physical damage to his solar plexus was severe, undoubtedly, but the psychological destruction was catastrophic. Donovan had spent a decade building a fortress of dense, chemically enhanced muscle tissue. He had eaten thousands of pounds of raw protein, injected himself with synthetic hormones, and screamed at inanimate objects just to construct an illusion of invulnerability. All of it, every single brutal hour spent under the barbell, was dismantled in 5 seconds by a man who wore canvas slip-ons and weighed less than a golden retriever. Whir, snap, whir, snap. Reese kept skipping, but he was not a cinematic god untouched by physical exertion. This was the reality Cole found far more compelling than the brief violence. Reese was working. His chest rose and fell with rapid, controlled inhalations through the nose and forceful exhalations through the mouth. The thin cotton of his white t-shirt began to cling to his ribs, soaking through with perspiration. His face was set in a mask of rigid concentration, his jaw clamped tight. Suddenly, the leather rope snagged the toe of Reese's left shoe. The rhythm broke. The rope slapped loudly against his calf, leaving a sharp red welt on the pale skin. Reese stumbled slightly, his balance faltering for a fraction of a second. He did not smile perfectly. He did not brush it off with superhuman grace. Instead, he hissed a sharp, annoyed breath through his teeth. He muttered something quick and harsh in Cantonese, a distinctly human expression of frustration. He untangled the leather from his shoe, reset his posture, and immediately launched back into the rhythm, spinning the rope twice as fast to punish himself for the error. That stumble grounded everything for Cole. It proved Reese was not magic. He was flesh and blood. He made mistakes. He felt pain. But his discipline was so horrifyingly absolute that it masked his humanity to the untrained eye. Cole looked back down at his own hands, resting on the laminated counter of the front desk. His fingernails were bitten down to the quick. He felt a sudden, profound wave of cynicism wash over him. He looked around the gym, truly seeing it for the first time. The racks of heavy iron dumbbells, the intricate cable machines, the chalk buckets, and the heavy leather lifting belts. It all looked like a collection of useless junk. It was a playground for insecure men chasing an aesthetic that offered no practical utility. They were lifting weights to look dangerous, while Reese lifted nothing and actually was dangerous. Donovan finally managed to drag himself upright. He didn't stand all at once. He pushed his massive weight off the floor in agonizing stages, his boots slipping slightly on his own spit. He clutched his stomach with his left arm, wrapping it tightly around his torso as if trying to hold his broken ribs in place. His right arm hung limp and useless. He looked at the floor, absolutely refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. The aggressive, chest-puffing tyrant who had terrorized the gym for years was gone. In his place was a severely concussed, deeply humiliated man trying desperately to find oxygen. He stumbled toward the locker room, leaning heavily against the mirrored wall for support. He left a smeared trail of sweat across the glass. The heavy wooden door of the locker room swung shut behind him with a dull click. The heavy weights remained untouched on the floor where Donovan had dropped them earlier. Nobody moved to rack them. Nobody dared to claim his empty bench. The territory had been violently conquered, but the conqueror had absolutely no interest in holding it. Whir, snap, whir, snap. Reese jumped for another 10 minutes. By the end, the gray canvas of his shoes was dark with sweat. He stopped abruptly, catching the leather cord under his armpit. He was breathing heavily, his lungs pulling deeply from the warm, stale air. He walked back to his wooden plyometric box and sat down. He didn't look triumphant. He just looked tired. Cole reached under the counter and pulled out a fresh, dry rag. He began wiping down the cheap laminate, pressing hard, trying to scrub away the invisible tension that coated every surface of the room. The familiar smells of Ironworks Gym, the metallic tang of iron oxide, the sour stench of unwashed neoprene, the sharp sting of ammonia were suddenly overwhelming, nauseating. Over by the heavy bag, Reese was unpacking his hands. He gripped the end of the white athletic tape with his teeth and pulled. The dry rip echoed sharply. As he unwound the thick layers from his right hand, Cole noticed the damage. The knuckles were not pristine. The friction of the tape, combined with the immense kinetic force he had driven into Donovan's chest, had taken a toll. The skin over Reese's index and middle knuckles was scraped raw, a bright, angry cherry red, weeping a tiny amount of clear plasma. Reese stared at his bruised hand for a long moment. He didn't massage it. He didn't wince. He simply cataloged the damage with a clinical, detached stare. He reached into his beat-up canvas duffel bag and pulled out a dented aluminum thermos. Unscrewing the cap, he took a slow, measured sip of lukewarm water, swishing it around his mouth before swallowing. The locker room door squealed open. Donovan emerged. He was fully dressed now, having thrown a heavy black hoodie over his massive, trembling frame despite the 90-degree heat inside the building. The hood was pulled up, casting a dark shadow over his pale, sweaty face. He carried his gym bag over his left shoulder, still fiercely protecting his midsection with his right arm. He didn't look toward the free weight corner. He didn't look at the heavy bag. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the rubber matting directly in front of his boots. He walked with a heavy, shuffling limp, every step seemingly sending a jolt of fresh agony through his bruised diaphragm. As he passed the front desk, Cole saw the profound emptiness in the big man's eyes. The belligerent fire, the artificial confidence built on steroids and intimidation, was entirely extinguished. He looked hollowed out. "Have a good one, Donovan," Cole said. The words slipped out of his mouth automatically, a conditioned reflex from years of customer service. Donovan didn't answer. He didn't even turn his head. He just pushed the glass front door open with his good arm and stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun, disappearing into the heat waves rising off the asphalt parking lot. Cole watched the door slowly swing shut, the hydraulic hinge hissing softly. He turned his attention back to Reese. Reese was finishing packing his duffel bag. He neatly coiled his leather jump rope, placing it carefully beside the dented thermos. He grabbed his sweaty white towel and wiped down the back of his neck, the coarse fabric scratching against his short, dark hair. He zipped the bag shut with a sharp final tug. Cole expected Reese to walk over. He expected some kind of acknowledgement, a nod of mutual understanding, a cynical remark about the big man's fragile ego. Human nature craves a shared postmortem after an event of extreme stress. Cole wanted Reese to validate what had just happened, to offer some profound philosophical martial arts wisdom that Cole could latch onto. Instead, Reese slung the canvas strap over his shoulder. He picked up his pace, walking lightly across the rubber mats toward the exit. He didn't swagger. He didn't look at the other bodybuilders, who were still standing around like cattle waiting out a thunderstorm. As Reese neared the front desk, Cole stood up a little straighter, gripping his dry rag tightly. "Hey," Cole blurted out, the single syllable sounding loud and clumsy in his own ears. Reese stopped. He turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto Cole. There was no warmth in his gaze, but there was no hostility either. It was completely neutral, devastatingly analytical. He looked at Cole the same way he had looked at his bruised knuckles. Cole suddenly felt incredibly foolish. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He's been asking for that for years. He's a bully. Reese's expression did not change. He didn't smile. He shifted the weight of his duffel bag slightly on his shoulder. "He is loud because he is terrified of silence," Reese said softly. "You build muscles to carry heavy things, but you cannot carry your own insecurities." He didn't wait for Cole to respond. The statement wasn't an invitation for dialogue. It was a simple statement of fact, as undeniable as gravity. Reese turned back toward the door, pushed it open, and walked out into the oppressive summer heat. The glass door sealed shut behind him, trapping the damp, heavy air back inside the gym. Cole stood completely still for a full minute, listening to the rattling cough of the swamp cooler. He looked out the window, but the street was empty. Reese was gone. Slowly, painfully, the gym began to reawaken. A heavy dumbbell clanked against a rack. Someone cleared their throat. The guy on the lat pull-down machine gripped the bar again, pulling the weight down with a hesitant, jerky motion. The metallic sounds of the iron sanctuary returned, but the fundamental frequency of the room had irrevocably shifted. Cole tossed his dry rag into the plastic bucket beneath the desk. He looked at the massive pile of iron plates sitting abandoned in Donovan's corner. They just looked heavy. They looked like a burden. Cole realized he didn't want to lift them anymore. He didn't want to build a cage. He walked out from behind the front desk, grabbed the shop broom leaning against the far wall, and began to sweep the loose white chalk dust off the black rubber mats, finally welcoming the total, overwhelming silence. Did this raw story of discipline over ego resonate with you? Real strength isn't about the space you take up. It is about the impact of your presence. If you appreciated this grounded look at martial arts history, please hit that like button, share this video with fellow enthusiasts, and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on this legendary encounter. We will bring you deep, untold stories every single week. Stay sharp and keep training.